so much. It's really an honor to be here. And it's so exciting to see this list of locations in the chat. I am delighted that people are joining from all over, and also really exciting to see some names of people I know and love dearly, and people whose names are belong to works I've learned from, people who I've interviewed, people from the larger Mahjong world, and then a lot of names people I haven't met yet. So I'm really grateful that all of you are here, and delighted to get to share this story with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and I'll share my screen for the duration of the talk, and then for Q&A, I'll come back. Okay. So there's a big question that brought us here today that's in the title of my talk and my book, and that is, how did a Chinese game shape modern American culture? We're going to think through that with a couple of related questions. How did Mahjong help create communities? And how, in that history, did it become a marker of both inclusion and exclusion? Before I start, I want to explain, for those of you who are not familiar with Mahjong, that it is a Chinese game of skill played by 4 people with domino-like engraved tiles that you can see here. And the tiles make suits, as lined up here. And players make specific combinations of tiles, and is often compared to the game, the card game Gin Rummy. Rather unusually, Mahjong can be played as a gambling game for high stakes, or as more of a parlor game for very, very low stakes. Today, a Mahjong resurgence is attracting new players, many of whom are learning a style known as American Mahjong, which is the specific variation that evolved from the original game and has become an important part of Jewish American women's culture. Over the past 100 years, Americans have woven Mahjong into the uneven process of becoming a multiracial democratic society, illuminating how different groups experienced the possibilities, limitations, and potential costs of integration. The history of how Mahjong, quote, became American is also a story of particular communities, quote, becoming American in the 20th century. One of the questions that I'm asked most frequently when I'm sharing this project is about, how did I come to this topic? Well, I took this picture, I'm not in it, but I came to Mahjong when I lived in China for a year before beginning my graduate program at Stanford, where I earned my PhD in history. And this is a photo from the very first game of Mahjong I ever played, when a friend taught me a very basic version of the game that her grandfather from Shanghai had taught her. The sensory aspects really captured me when I first interacted with the tiles. The sound that they make, the way that the tiles feel in your hand, they're cool, they're smooth, they're heavy. The designs are really beautiful, and each set tells its own story. And as I traveled through China, I saw Mahjong everywhere, and I saw how it brought people together. This is a photo of 4 shop workers on break playing in the street, and this is actually 3 women and a man who's sensibly wearing a sun hat. While American Mahjong is primarily, historically, a women's game, not exclusively, but historically that's largely true, Chinese Mahjong is both a men's and a women's game, and men and women might play separately or together. While I was living in China, my aunt visited me, and she wanted to know why her Jewish friends in Denver, Colorado played this Chinese game. And that is not an obvious connection. It turns out a lot of people have asked that question, but no one had done the historical research to find out. So my project has taken me on a research adventure. This is a smattering of images from sources that I found over that now dozen years of research. It's brought me to archives like the Parker Brothers room of old games housed right off the factory floor, to the scrapbook one of the league's founders made in the 1930s, and dozens of personal interviews and people who shared their memories, including Hilda, who's featured right here. So at any point in the Q&A, I'm also happy to talk more and answer questions related to research. There's a lot more to say about that behind the scenes story too. If you ask a longtime player about their physical Mahjong set, they will usually start to gush enthusiastically. Its sensory and material qualities, the Chinese designs, the sound of the tiles, the way they feel, like I was talking about, as well as beliefs about the, quote, authenticity of certain materials and the way individual sets get associated with individual players that can then get passed down generations. These are all important to its history. During the 20th century, a range of Americans engaged with this Chinese parlor game, not just as an entertaining consumer good, but especially as a way to build community. Exploring Mahjong in widely varied settings, from Shanghai salons to American Chinatowns, Los Angeles women's clubs, Catskills resorts, and post-war suburbia, my book places the game at the heart of modern redefinitions of gender, race, and consumer culture. The book unfolds in two parts, from its Chinese origins and the trans-Pacific consumer fad to American Chinatowns and suburbs. That first half is focused on Mahjong's history as related to consumerism, and I closely examine its economic and cultural origins in China and in the 1920s United States. The second half of the book explores how Mahjong interwove with the experiences of inclusion and exclusion in the evolving definition of what it means to be American. And here I focus particularly on the Chinese American and Jewish American parts of the story. My talk today weaves together a few strands of this story and particularly zooms in on Mahjong in 1930s Chinatowns as a way of thinking about how Mahjong became a part of Chinese American communities in the 1930s. But I'll try to give you an overview of the book as a whole, and we'll certainly talk about the 1920s fad. And if there are any additional questions in the Q&A, we're very happy to answer those. Again, a lot of this will necessarily be a brief overview. So let's begin with an introduction to the origins of the game. Mahjong evolved as one of many mostly male gambling games in the area around Shanghai in the mid to late 1800s. And it became part of the cosmopolitan courtesan culture, as you can see here in a print from the 1890s. It became increasingly popular among the growing number of Chinese businessmen and expatriates who lived in Shanghai after World War I. Matrons and single women played an essential role in integrating Mahjong into expatriate social patterns and communicating the growing fad to families at home. A number of individuals, most famously a Standard Oil representative named Joseph Park Babcock, successfully brought Mahjong to the United States via California, and specifically San Francisco, in 1922, and marketed it all over the country. His business headquarters was actually right near the Ferry Building in San Francisco. It took off like wildfire. This is an advertisement from the early period of the fad from a store in Sacramento. And it's typical of advertisements all over the country at the time. Marketers, first mostly white, soon also Chinese, imported thousands of sets, mostly from the area around Shanghai and through Shanghai itself. They advertised it as Mahjong, two words with the double G at the end, as an exotic, sophisticated game that could compete with the popular card game of bridge. Soon, the most elite Americans, from President and First Lady Harding to Hollywood celebrities, were playing it. Just 2 years after its introduction, Americans made Mahjong sets Shanghai's 6th largest export to the United States. Congress even added a tax law specifically targeting Mahjong sets in 1924. In a year that they actually otherwise reduced taxes, they added one for Mahjong sets. Americans had long followed Europe's lead in importing specific Chinese goods as markers of refinement, but for the first time, American consumers, particularly women, led the way. As the voracious American market developed an unimagined appetite for the game, in 1923, Chinese and Western merchants together launched new kinds of large-scale factories in Shanghai that combined a handcrafted manufacturing process with streamlined production. The tiles in this time period were made out of cow bone spliced together with bamboo. And if you look at the caption here of this photograph, these are two craftsmen in Shanghai, you can see that they're cutting shin bones, it says, from the USA. Chinese manufacturers of the bamboo and bone tiles actually ran out of the nation's supply of cow shin bones that were used to make those tiles. So ships exporting bones from Chicago stockyards to Shanghai crossed paths with those exporting Mahjong sets from Shanghai to the United States. Chinese exporters making the bone and bamboo tiles imported so much cow bone from US stockyards that the global price of bone skyrocketed. The fad was truly across groups of class and race, and also across the nation. The primary media imagery, however, this idea that gets so strongly associated in advertising and in broader representations of the game, showed it to be an urban game played by white socialites in Chinese costume, or what they imagined to be ancient royal Chinese costume. Women like this society matron in Los Angeles, a Vanderbilt daughter in a Mahjong themed ballet in New York City, shown here, or a middle-class housewife in Atlanta who read this article explaining how to host a Chinese themed luncheon, which was, quote, all the rage. White women in ornate Chinese costumes experimented with exotic personae for their own purposes to push and experiment with new boundaries of respectability, of respectable femininity and sexuality. The Mahjong craze hit at the same time in American culture that there was the full takeoff of mass marketing techniques, including advertising, catalogs, store displays, and Mahjong was in all of it. And here, that image I just zipped past a moment ago, slightly in the wrong spot, I apologize. This is a picture of Bullock's, a department store in Los Angeles. And here you can see, this is an incredibly detailed image, and it's worth taking a minute and really paying attention to what you see in the store, the glass display case, what is behind her. This is a white sales girl dressed in Chinese costume. And she's there to usher in customers for a newly immersive kind of shopping experience. In this case, what would have been called, quote, a trip to the Orient. And you can see the influence of consumer Orientalism, which is a mishmash of Chinese and Japanese and possibly even Middle Eastern goods, which was typical at the time as Americans lumped, quote, the East or the Orient altogether. And the store's goal was to use this kind of experience to sell various kinds of Mahjong sets along with other related accoutrements, which you can see again in the glass case and behind her. From its introduction into American society, newspapers, advertisers, and popular media consistently discussed Mahjong as an embodiment of authentic Chinese culture. And a lot of that discussion was based in stereotypical understandings. Americans really did not know much about China, by and large. Most importantly, dominant American culture has a long history of seeing the defining feature of Chinese people as being inherently different from Westerners. Chinese and Japanese Americans could not become naturalized citizens because of this idea of unassimilability, that they would remain perpetual foreigners, regardless of longevity of residence and integration into communities. So the 1920s are remembered as a freewheeling jazz age, but it was also a deeply racist era. And here I'm going to, again, return to where we were and show you this image, which should be a shocking image of the Ku Klux Klan marching in front of down Pennsylvania Avenue in the nation's capital as a show of strength in 1925. And I'm showing this image as an indication of how mainstream nativist and racist ideology was, often cloaked in a very kind of family-friendly mainstream American culture. I'm not going to show you the many caricatured Chinese cartoons because I actually don't want to be a part of circulating those images. But anti-Asian and stereotypical Asian depictions was a part of Mahjong advertising as well. And it pervaded the game's introduction to the United States. Even as Mahjong became wildly popular explicitly as a Chinese game. Promoters and players alike gleefully celebrated the quote, great, exciting, hundreds of years old national Chinese game, now the craze of America. So how is that possible? Why was that happening? In part, the game's ironic success depended upon marketers skillfully exploiting the complex and contradictory symbolism of China in American culture. Alongside negative stereotypes of unsophisticated laborers, cheap chop suey, and tradition-bound backwardness, white Americans also held ancient China in high esteem as an earlier paragon of civilization. White Americans imagined themselves learning a game, especially of Confucius and of courtly mandarins. And you can see this imagery here, again, in a newspaper article, very, very typical of the kinds of imagery that was associated both in advertising and in just general media coverage. They enjoyed playing with the idea of an ancient royal Chinese culture, but it was totally divorced from real contemporary people, including Chinese Americans. Mahjong was, in fact, a modern game, less than a century old, but advertisers created an air of exoticism to create excitement while also distancing the game from Chinese American contemporaries. And it worked. White Americans embraced a Chinese game while still rejecting Chinese people. Chinese Americans, meanwhile, leveraged Mahjong's popularity for economic opportunities in a highly discriminatory economy. And you can see actually there are two Chinese American men. We only know the name of Mr. William Wong, who's standing in the Western suit, teaching these four white women how to play Mahjong, and their photo was in a newspaper. And in a context where Chinese Americans who had been born and raised in the United States had gone to American universities, graduated with degrees in English and art and engineering, could not find work outside of racialized discriminatory economic tracks like restaurant work or laundry. Mahjong, although it meshed with stereotyped knowledge, it was a genuine economic opportunity that provided much more high-paying opportunities than what was often available. Young Chinese Americans also leveraged the moment for cultural authority, for speaking to a broader public on behalf of as self-conscious representatives of Chinese culture and Chinese Americans. And this article shows an image of a college student named Eleanor Chan. She's a USC college student. And unusually, she's named and photographed and featured in a newspaper speaking against a white American who was Joseph Parke Babcock. This is in the thick of some of these marketing wars where Babcock is positioning himself as the creator of the game to try to hold on to his exclusive control of the market. He's not successful in that, but he does succeed in making a lot of Chinese Americans very angry at that claim. And so here is a moment where she's saying, you did not make this up. This is a Chinese game. And she is being listened to and featured and believed. So beginning in the 1920s, in Chinatowns across the United States, The rumble of shuffling mahjong tiles could be heard in apartments, association halls, and the back rooms of general stores as the game became a fixture in Chinese American communities. Mahjong's cultural meaning emerged in the context of the global 1920s fad. By the 1930s, Mahjong stood in both China and abroad as, quote, the national game of China. Over the following decade, Mahjong became embedded in a built landscape of Chinatown spaces that served dual purposes, facing outward to white consumers and facing inward to Chinese Americans. In the process, the game became established in the tension between inclusion and exclusion that would define the experience of Chinese American ethnicity in the early 20th century. This image, I think, also is another one that exemplifies that tension. It's of the San Francisco Chinatown telephone exchange that was both this a place of connecting the community apart from the prying eyes of tourists, apart from a kind of advertised image of Chinatown. It was really connecting Chinatown residents with each other. And at the same time, because of its architecture and because of the unique ways that it functioned, it itself also was a tourist draw. And as you can see, there were postcards made of it, circulated at the time. For Chinese Americans, as for other players, Mahjong was a way to gather around an enjoyable and a stimulating game. But the game's particular history as a Chinese game that also became enormously popular in the United States shaped its meaning, helping to spread its popularity as many Chinese Americans embraced Mahjong for both its perceived Chineseness and its perceived Americanness. Chinese Americans interacted with Mahjong in ways that, in effect, helped navigate tensions associated with Americanization. Chinatown residents participated in commodifying and marketing Mahjong as an aspect of Chinese culture for outsiders. And this is an image from a Chinese curio shop from Chicago's Chinatown in the 1930s. They also used it at the same time to create separate ethnic spaces for Chinese Americans to engage with each other. The presence of Mahjong through the noises of the tiles and the language of gameplay, through its visual presence in public spaces and in private homes, that all helped mark a geographic space of ethnic community. For Chinese Americans, playing Mahjong was not about assimilation in contrast to cultural continuity, nor was it the opposite. Rather, it was a versatile pastime that helped create spaces for a shared Chinese American experience. It would be easy to assume that Chinese Americans were already familiar with Mahjong by the time of the American fad, but just the opposite is true. In the 1920s, as this photograph is from the 1920s in Portland, Oregon, where I live, many Chinese Americans began playing the game along with the broader American public. It was simply not a widespread part of Chinese culture before the early 20th century. It was in certain urban areas, but it was not widespread. For most Chinese American players at the time, it was not yet rooted in family traditions or memories of the homeland, but it represented a tie to Chinese heritage nonetheless. And it was rapidly spreading in popularity in China as well. So very, very quickly, again, becoming known as the national game of China, domestically and abroad. During the 1920s, as path-breaking Chinese American sociologist Party Low, photographed here, noted, the Mahjong craze, quote, obsessed all Chinatown. After the fad ended by the late 1920s, Chinese Americans faced different challenges in the 1930s when merchants sought to attract tourists to Chinatown during the Great Depression to try to bring, again, much needed dollars into the local economy. Iconic representations of Chinatown featured the curving pagoda roof lines, bright colors that you can see on this postcard, neon chop suey signs appealing to tourists, to outsiders. This is a photograph of a Chinatown tour in the 1940s in Manhattan. Behind and around those external facing commercial facades were private spaces for living and for a Chinese American public life. Chinatowns also drew Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans from the surrounding regions as economic and cultural hubs, especially in San Francisco. And this is an image of San Francisco's Chinatown. The game provided one ritual of connection, unique in its ability to cross boundaries of gender and generation into diverse spaces. It was also part of a complex dynamic for Chinese Americans facing China, crossing between China and the United States, and building connections across the Pacific. In some ways, Mahjong functioned in similar ways as other kinds of cultural connections, such as consuming medicinal herbs. And I love this image from a Chinese herbalist in Los Angeles. This image is at the Huntington Library. And here it again is this great combination of modern styles and what they're advertising are also traditional medicinal herbs. Cantonese opera, gambling with dominoes, all of these are other kinds of cultural connective tissue. But Mahjong's strategies and rhythms and its small groups of 4 players created consistent cultural patterns. In addition, its meaning as a game that could be simultaneously American and Chinese, and its unusual ability to bridge multiple kinds of social spaces across gender and generational divides meant that it served unique purposes in creating a larger sense of Chinese American ethnicity. This is a game, obviously, much more contemporary times. Some of what I'm talking about is specific to historical moments and context, and some of what I'm talking about, especially in regards to the rhythms of the game and the meanings that it has have attached to it over time, are very much still true today. The game's tiles created a particularly resonant sense of a Chinese cultural space. When players shuffled the tiles, the clattering rumble could echo down alleyways. Walking along Chinatown sidewalks, one observer noted, a visitor could hear flowing from the windows, quote, dominoes and mahjong pieces click crisply, and the voluble conversation of the excited players. Chinatown's homes, shops, and association halls became communal mahjong spaces. Conversely, bringing mahjong outside those boundaries risked raising the players' racial profiles. In her memoir, Sweet Bamboo, the pioneering Chinese-American reporter, Louise Leung Larson, wrote about how her father, who was a successful Los Angeles herbalist, once brought a mahjong set along on his family outing to the beach. Although Louise was a young woman by that point in the 1920s, and she was an avid mahjong player with her friends, she later explained that, quote, we didn't want to play. We got stared at enough without playing mahjong in public. And her fears were well-founded. The Chicago Tribune published word of, quote, real Chinese actually playing mahjong when they were spotted outside of Chinatown. As an area marked by the racialized people who lived in it, Chinatown was a socially constructed space. Inside safe spaces, this could help build community, while outside it could reinforce a sense of difference and exclusion. Once established, mahjong was a frequent presence in Chinese commercial spaces, where community members and shopkeepers played together in the backs of shops. And here is an image of 1942 New York City General Store. You can't see a mahjong set here. There may very well have been one where we can't see behind it. The image I showed before was from an exhibit in the Chinese American Museum of Los Angeles, and they have the mahjong set that was from that space also as part of the exhibit. For laborers, games provided relaxation, male bonding, or the addictive escapism of gambling. Mahjong was also ubiquitous in the primarily male spaces of family association halls, like this one preserved through the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle, and gambling halls. This is a photograph from Locke, which is a historic community in the Sacramento Delta. And here you can see from the other side of the gambling hall, this Mahjong table, and it occupies, again, this interesting kind of medium space where it was a more social, less intensive gambling scene in the back of the gambling hall, but it was connected to it. Women played Mahjong primarily in low stakes female gatherings. So again, not as likely to be playing in a gambling hall. And it provided a vital thread of connection. This is a poster from 1930s Shanghai. In part because many older immigrant women retained traditional standards of respectability by staying indoors much of the time, older women in Chinatown would likely have played Mahjong with relatives or with other women in shared and crowded home spaces. Meanwhile, Chinese American youths and college students played the game with their friends and in their university associations. Because different generations engaged with Mahjong on their own terms, and because it gained enough respectability to be played in family settings, Mahjong became a rare intergenerational activity in Chinese American communities. Here we go back to that. For women, having sex-segregated but age-integrated games provided a key opportunity to socialize the younger generation. As Party Low described, quote, the Mahjong table becomes the training school, as it were, where the older generation of women pass on the traditional lore by word of mouth to the younger Americanized women. The generational conflict that marked society more generally during this time was experienced en masse in Chinese American families because of a demographic shift shaped by immigration policy. And here we return to our university students. By 1920, the older population had begun to decline due to the long-term effects of exclusion laws. So young adults who were American by birth, again, they would not have been eligible for naturalized citizenship, they formed a larger proportion of the community. This is the actress Anna May Wong and her sister. And I hope most of the audience is familiar with her and her work already. She's an important and fascinating figure who becomes also a really important piece of shaping 1920s popular culture, and for better and for worse, also ideas of Chinese Americans. In addition to the broader American youth rebellion of the 1920s, across the Pacific, young progressive reformers in China sought to remake Chinese society as well. In the United States, both young and old faced conflicting pressures as Chinese Americans, and they responded with a broad spectrum of accommodation, resistance, and negotiation. Meanwhile, integration into American society seemed to demand assimilation. Many, especially 1920s youth, felt pressured to choose between being Chinese or being American. New Year's celebrations provide a particularly clear example of how Mahjong could be generationally specific and a possible bridge between generations. In the Chinese New Year, gambling is traditionally seen as bringing good luck. It is also a time of homecoming, of spending time together as family. So as a family game and as a gambling game, Mahjong was played everywhere in homes across generations, and it still is. In contrast, American New Year, January 1st, was a time of peer celebrations. Second generation adults would throw Mahjong and dance parties where, quote, the conversation is practically conducted in nothing but English, usually slang of the cheapest variety, for they too feel that New Year's Eve is an evening of freedom from restriction. This is Party Low's voice. If games are played, the betting tends to be steep, liquor flows freely, some man inevitably gets drunk, and the party waxes merry loud, ending only around dawn. Older Chinatown residents attended Chinese theater or stayed inside to play Mahjong or Chinese dominoes, and those games often lasted all night. So these scenes of generational difference and simultaneity at Mahjong parties on American New Year's provides a snapshot of how Chinatowns were places of concurrent Americanization and the creation of Chinese American ethnicity. For Chinese Americans, Mahjong also provided a sense of connection with China and with a global Chinese community. As Japanese aggression in China worsened in the late 1930s, Chinese Americans also used Mahjong in fundraisers for war relief. And here you can see one example in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1938. There's no mention of Mahjong in this photograph, but you would see that in references in the newspapers. Not all members of the community, however, found common ground over a Mahjong game. This is a photograph of a group of Chinese American men in front of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia. And it's worth pointing out that although Mahjong successfully transitioned into class-based respectability, meaning the middle class and upwardly striving people could play it without associating with a scene of vice or underworld, it did not gain Christian approval as a moral activity. Despite American preconceptions that an anti-gambling Chinese person was oxymoronic, the game's 1920s popular sweep did not successfully penetrate strongly Chinese Christian American communities. Now, missionaries in China, American Protestant missionaries in particular, they launched campaigns, writing letters back and forth across the Pacific against Mahjong as a corrupting force. Chinese American Christian leaders did not do that, but it was a really notable absence from community events and from activities of Christian affiliated groups, including in the YMCA or related activities, even for second and third generations. Those activities would involve American sports such as baseball and basketball, or philanthropic events, or the ever respectable Western game of bridge. But again, in a broader context where Mahjong was quite diverse and ubiquitous, was a glaring absence. This is a set from Wing Luke Museum in Seattle. Mahjong's cultural meaning emerged in the context of the global 1920s fad. And by the 1930s, again, it really had become known both in China and abroad as, quote, the national game of China. Questions of visibility and respectability shaped the strategies Chinese Americans employed to market aspects of Chinese culture as consumer experiences, as well as positive cultural representation in the face of a history of anti-Chinese sentiment. Yet Mahjong was never just an outsider's game, nor Chinatown's primarily externally facing tourist destinations. By examining interactions with this game, with whom and where in a landscape of Mahjong, we see how the game provided one ritual of connection, unique in its ability to cross boundaries of gender and generation into diverse spaces. My book covers then a longer history continuing on into the 1960s, and particularly with the development and the growth of something called American Mahjong. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of that history now. Along with Chinese Americans, other pockets of players remained after the 1920s fad years. And from these seeds emerged new and uniquely American variants of the game. The most influential adaptation by far was driven by the National Mahjong League. In the late 1930s, this picture is from the 1960s, but they were founded in the late 1930s, a group of Jewish women in New York established the league to revitalize what they believed was a wrongfully neglected game. After World War II, Mahjong became embedded in middle-class Jewish American neighborhoods across the country. Women played the game in summer vacationing communities like the Catskills, where Mahjong peppered the landscape, and they taught their friends at home. Eventually, hundreds of thousands of players, mostly but not exclusively Jewish American women, played the league's, quote, national version of the international Chinese game. The league's game is what is popularly known today as, quote, American Mahjong. In contrast to the version imported from China years earlier that was similar to Gin Rummy, the league created a smaller number of acceptable winning hands with more variations in combinations. By the 1960s, the league's repeated changes had transformed the game enough that it required additional tiles and different rules. I'm not going to go into the details of American Mahjong now, but I'm happy to answer questions again in the Q&A or refer you to additional information. And I do talk about it a lot more in the book. The National Mahjong League followed a pattern cultural groups have followed for decades in negotiating their place in American culture. It took a shared reference point from Mahjong's American past and transformed it into something different. When the league codified its style of play in the 1930s, it marked the cultural and physical Americanization of the game. And here you can see a Mahjong set that was actually fabricated in the United States in the 1960s. And that was a process that continued through the following decades. Overall, however, the tiles shared the same increasingly standardized Chinese originated designs that kept it a recognizable form of Mahjong. Not entirely, but almost exclusively. Young Jewish mothers in particular forged American Mahjong culture during the 1950s and 60s. In the midst of massive suburbanization and newfound upward mobility for many, regular weekly Mahjong games helped women build female-focused networks. Unusually, these groups focused not on volunteerism or children's education, but were instead times simply for women to have fun together. Regional patterns varied, but from Atlanta to Philadelphia and from Los Angeles to Detroit, groups across the country played the same game at parallel places and times while noshing on similar snacks. In doing so, players created a cultural touchstone for many who grew up in post-war Jewish American homes, along with the tile racks, which you can see here, coin purses, that was in one of the previous images, and plates of maraschino-studded pineapple slices that usually accompanied the game. And here you can actually see this woman's hand by the shell of a pineapple as she's tapping her cigarette. Although no one stated this intention explicitly at the time, for middle-class Jewish Americans, Mahjong, associated with both Chinese culture, notably non-Christian culture, and the outmoded 1920s fad, served to distinguish their evolving ethnic identity. In the midst of newly possible but still tenuous promises of integration and upward mobility, Jewish Americans confronted the risks of cultural loss that could come with assimilation into middle-class white suburbia. To be clear, players approached Mahjong first and foremost as a game, just like I said before. However, as it became a marker of Jewish neighborhoods and was no longer widely popular in the way that it was during the fad years, Mahjong also subtly demarcated space apart from the dominant Protestant society. The game's adaptability created barriers as well as bridges as players pushed the evolution of distinctive Mahjong variants. And I should have explained, this image is actually from a contemporary artist who says that he creates images specifically about Jewish culture to mark the things that we all have in common. And Mahjong is featured here in one of them. Today, more than 40 variations of Mahjong exist around the world, each expressing a unique history of adaptation and each shaping specific cultures of interaction and play, from Japan's competitive Riichi to graveside games in the Philippines, as you can see here, along with food. This is part of a larger communal celebration of those loved ones who have gone before. In the United States, a thriving range of Mahjong styles reflects the diverse growth of Asian American communities since immigration reform, as well as a resurgence of interest in the National Mahjong League's game, spreading now beyond Jewish women's original networks. This is a picture from Bryant Park in Manhattan. And you can see actually also, again, expressing the rich diversity both of New York and of an increasingly diversified Mahjong landscape. Mahjong's American history is rooted in the tension between inclusion and exclusion, as well as the risks of cultural erasure through appropriation or assimilation. Mahjong reveals the deeply American experience, sometimes desired and sometimes enforced, of simultaneously belonging and standing apart. And here, as a brief set of recommendations, if people are interested in reading further, I tried to pull out some texts that are wonderful and rich, but also accessible and enjoyable to a non-academic audience as well, that relate to the topics that I talked about today. So thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. If you don't have time to write something down that you're interested in right here, please feel free to get in touch with me or with USF and look at the recording, and we can get you these names too. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.